domestic product? Is it an increase in per capita income? Is it a diversification of the economy? Is it with reference to developing a sizable manufacturing sector to go along with your agricultural sector? Does it mean to develop a substantial sector of services as well as manufacturing? What exactly is economic development? First of all, it's almost always used as a synonym for economic growth. Economic development means growth, more goods, more services, which are produced in the particular country or the particular region involved. Okay. What causes that? What facilitates that? What makes that more difficult? Okay. In a sense, it's very simple. Economic development basically is the same phenomenon as the productive process. Greater material well-being for a country or a region. China has been developing very rapidly. Zimbabwe has been going the opposite direction very rapidly. Other countries have been stagnant. Japan has been stagnant now for 2 decades. Its economy has been going nowhere, neither up nor down, basically. Greater material well-being. In terms of a country, of course, you can get to greater material well-being by two ways: increasing production at a greater rate than your increase in population, or by keeping your production at the same level and having your population decrease. Everybody will have more goods. The people will have greater material well-being even though there's no increase in production. Even if there's a decrease in production, if the population is decreasing at a higher rate, people will have more goods, and therefore there will be greater material well-being. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration. In other words, what does it mean to say that China is richer? Anybody who has traveled in the interior of China knows that a lot of China looks like Haiti. Regions of China have developed very rapidly. Portions of the Chinese population have certainly increased. The Chinese economy as a whole has increased rapidly, but China has a very large population, and the national income per capita is still very low. All of the same can be said for India. Other countries have been growing well and have relatively small populations, and of course material well-being will increase very rapidly in those countries. But what does it mean? As we pointed out, to have greater material well-being, you have to have greater consumption. In order to have greater consumption, you have to have greater production, and that's what economic development is. The putting together of the factors of production in a way which increases investment and production, and therefore and consumption, and therefore greater material well-being. And what is all that based on? As we discussed before, 2 factors. And if you have those 2 factors, the economy is going to develop. If you have them only in part, it will develop less well. If you don't have them at all, it will not develop. If they are negative, it will decline. And that is stability, social stability, and a sufficient degree of economic freedom. You don't have to have libraries full of tomes and journals full of articles about economic development. What you need to do is to make it clear that any country or region that has substantial degree of social stability, and that means it has a rule of law, whether it is formally a democracy or not, and a substantial degree of economic freedom. It may not have a whole lot of political freedom, but if it has a substantial degree of economic freedom and social stability, it will develop economically. To the degree it does not have those things, it will not develop at the same rate. To the degree that it is entirely missing those things, if the social situation is one of chaos, if the economy is entirely tied up in knots, it will not develop, it will decline. We'll give you two examples, both from Asia, South Korea and Taiwan. Both countries were extremely poor at the end of World War II. They were towards the bottom of the international scale of economic development, national wealth, per capita national income, very low. Both countries were dictatorships for a long time after World War II. But both countries had social stability, and both countries had a large degree of economic freedom. So even though they did not become democracies for many years after the end of the war, they started to grow very rapidly. And now, given their size, both South Korea and Taiwan are highly developed countries with positions in the economic scale of GDP, total GDP and GDP growth, and per capita GDP and per capita growth, and so on and so forth, at the upper end of all countries in the world. Plus, they both became, with the passage of time, democracies. So, you have the best of all worlds, starting from the worst of all worlds. And that all happened in about a 50-year period. That can be followed by any country in the world. If you do that, if you do what Taiwan and South Korea did, you will develop rapidly. Deng Xiaoping, following the demise of the Maoist regime in China, which had taken any number of wrong-headed measures and had ruined a great deal of China, is famous for saying, "It doesn't matter what color the cat is as long as it catches mice." He also said, being rich is glorious. And what he did was free up the Chinese economy to a very large extent. Now, China, unlike South Korea and Taiwan, is not rapidly developing towards democracy. The rule of law is very questionable in China. Social stability is okay on the coastal areas and so on. It's very poor in the interior. There are lots of demonstrations and riots and marches, tens of thousands every year in the interior of China. And unlike South Korea and Taiwan, it also has ethnic problems with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the Tibetans in Tibet. Nevertheless, simply by freeing up to a large extent, not completely by any means, but to a substantial extent the economic system, China was able to begin to grow very rapidly. When I say very rapidly, I'm talking about between 9 and 12% per annum, which is a very rapid increase. Now, if you go in the opposite direction, as was the case with Argentina, which in 1930 was one of the richest countries in the world, both in absolute terms and in terms of per capita wealth, started on a cycle. In 1930, started in a cycle of coup d'etats, military governments, systemic corruption, uh, overborrowing followed by default, followed by overborrowing again, followed by default again, until at the present time, a country with all the natural advantages that a country could want in terms of population size, in terms of natural resources, vast areas of the most excellent agricultural land in the world, mineral deposits of all kinds, oil and gas deposits, and so on, has since 1930 been declining in its position in the world. Now, there have been periods when there was relative stability and relative economic freedom when it began to develop again. But they were always followed by periods of social instability, government interference, and tying the economy into knots, overborrowing, and default. So if you contrast what happened in South Korea and Taiwan on the one side, and what happened in Argentina and is still happening in Argentina on the other side, you have most of what you need to know about the process of economic development. Let me just make a general statement at this point. We've been talking about economic development. We've talked about the productive process, exchange, supply and demand. I often say that economics is 90% common sense and 10% money. All of what we've been talking about has to do with common sense and its opposite, which is nonsense. The economic process is self-regulating and takes care of itself to a very large extent, which doesn't mean that there are not and will not be crooks. Economic crooks as well as other kinds of crooks. And obviously, the governments have to combat fraud and theft, as well as murder and vandalism and all the other things. Nevertheless, governments do much more damage to the economic system and thereby to the material well-being of their populations than all the economic crooks put together. Probably the greatest economic crook, financial crook in this case, in the history of, perhaps in the history of the world, certainly in the history of the United States, was Bernie Madoff. He stole $50 billion. That's pocket cash to the U.S. government, or to the governments of Europe, or Japan, or China, or Russia, or India, or most of the countries of the world. Bernie Madoff did a lot of damage. He did a lot of damage to a limited number of people. The U.S. government does a lot of damage, much greater damage, to 300 million people. Bernie Madoff was eventually unmasked, tried, convicted, and put in prison. Try doing that with the Secretary of the Treasury, or the President of the United States, or the Minister of Economy of France, or the Minister of Finance of Japan. It won't happen, and it isn't going to happen. It's common sense. If it makes sense, it's probably right. If it doesn't make sense, it's probably wrong from the standpoint of economic welfare. Now, granted, there are other possible criteria that have to be taken into consideration and which may make economic rationality less than a uniform, universal principle. And in fact, they do. Man does not live by bread alone, as it has been said. Some individuals are, and some organizations are, have primary non-economic motivations. As again, material well-being is not the same thing as spiritual well-being, physical well-being, emotional well-being, etc. But ladies and gentlemen, let me put it this way. You're not going to have all those other things unless you have the ability and the resources and the finances and the income to put them into effect. Cultural well-being is not going to take place unless ballet troupes can be financed, unless symphony orchestras and great art museums and opera troupes and theater companies can be financed. Churches and synagogues and other places of worship cannot minister to the spiritual well-being of their congregations unless they have access to resources, economic resources. Now, it's not true, as Karl Marx said, that economics is everything. But it is true that without an economic foundation, there is nothing. Literally, there is nothing. And that has been true from the time that families clad in animal skins and armed with stone tools and weapons hunted and fished and gathered fruits and berries. And it's still true today. And it has been true all of history in between. Economics is not everything. By no means is it everything. For many people, it's not the most important thing. I'm sure that for most of you, if not all of you, and certainly for me, it's not the most important thing. But it is the thing without which I cannot do or achieve those other things that are more important in and of themselves. It is therefore the one necessary thing along with physical well-being, health. The economic system, of course, must be physically healthy also, which is why war and natural disasters are not good for the economy and are not good for society and economic development. Despite idiotic analyses saying, well, don't worry about Hurricane Sandy, because now think of all the money that's going to be spent on putting those houses back together and the schools and hospitals and everything else that were ruined. Look at how well Germany and Japan and Italy developed after World War II, even though they were ruined in the war. It would have been better for New Jersey and Connecticut and New York and all that if Hurricane Sandy had not taken place. It would have been better for Germany and Japan and Italy and also France and England and everybody else if the Second World War had not taken place. This is one way in which nature in the one case and governments in the other case engage in the destruction of economic assets. Now, we can take preventive measures about natural disasters. When will mankind take the same kind of measures against man-made disasters, which lead to the reduction of the ability of human beings to achieve their goals, spiritual, cultural, social, physical, whatever, through economic resources which are developing and growing and making the other things more available constantly to more and more people. And ladies and gentlemen, let me make another comment that I've made before, but I make it again. The world is becoming more unequal in terms of the distribution of income. And that's because the contribution of capital to the productive process is becoming ever greater, and the contribution of labor is becoming ever smaller. And if we don't find the means of putting productive assets into the hands of more and more people through programs such as economic stock and employee stock ownership plans, community investment trusts, following examples like the Alaskan Native corporations, the Mondragon community in northern Spain, and others. If we don't start taking those kinds of measures to put more and more people into the position of owners of productive capital assets, the social effects of all of this are going to be huge. Governments are going to get larger and larger. More and more people are going to be confiscated in order to provide money for other people. That is not sustainable in the long term because the incentive to create wealth is taken away. And we're going to get back into the situation that the world got into in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, and that ended up in World War II. And somebody once said that the only thing that people learn from history is that no one ever learns anything from history. I hope that's not true. Unfortunately, it has been demonstrated over and over again that it is true. But I hope it's not too late for the peoples of the world to wake up as to what's necessary in order to have the kind of development and the spread of that development which is required. If the future is going to be one of greater and greater economic development, greater and greater wealth, distributed more and more widely, so that more and more human beings